Today I am going to try infrastructure as code in Azure. So what is infrastructure as code? Usually when somebody wants to create a resource in Azure, what they do is they jump into the Azure portal and create a resource. So if you have a subscription already, you can create any resource you want, basically web applications, virtual machines and things like that, by using Azure portal. So that's a nice way to do that, using the user interface. But usually in companies and all, where you need to automate things as part of your DevOps pipeline, a better approach or a preferred approach that's more modern is to automate things through infrastructure as code. So when you are doing an application deployment, the first step in that pipeline, in your code, is to create your resources, your infrastructure, like virtual machine, for example, and you make sure that you run that code, and your code goes into Azure and create those virtual machines, and things like that for you on the fly. And once you're done with that, you have the infrastructure, your VMs and all in place, and then you go ahead with your actual application deployment. So today we are going to take a look at how we can automate that infrastructure creation in Azure. For today's exercise, what we are going to do is we will be creating an Azure resource group first of all. So basically, Azure Resource Group is a way to organize all your resources. To give you an example, if you have an application, typically in most applications there will be a web application, a database. Sometimes you would have a background processing component like your batch jobs. So all of them are independent applications, but you can group them together under one resource group, and you can probably categorize them into development, QA, production, and things like that. So one model, you would put them into different resource groups, and you know you would have a, uh, dev resource group for your application. You would have another resource group that's for QA and production, and so on. So it gives you better control over that. For example, let's say you want to delete all of them together. So rather than deleting individual resources, you go to that resource group and just delete that resource group, and Azure would make sure that all the resources that you create within that resource group uh, get deleted at once. So that's basically the concept of a resource group. So anyway, so in today's example, uh, imagine you have an Azure environment that's kind of a clean slate. You don't have anything pre-existing there. So we are going to create a resource group first of all, and then we would be creating a network service group inside that. And within that network service group, we will be creating a virtual network or a VNet. Then we will also be creating a public IP and a network interface card. So all of them together sets a stage for your virtual machine creation. So the last thing that we are going to do is we will be creating a virtual machine and connect them together using this network interface card, public IP, the virtual network. So basically, we will be placing this virtual machine inside that VNet, and all of them would be, like I said, residing inside that single resource group. And then finally, we would try to connect to that virtual machine that we created for this exercise we would be using, so basically you have two options for your infrastructure as code in Azure. You can use Azure Resource Manager templates, or in short ARM templates, or you can use Bicep. So Bicep is a new new way of doing infrastructure as code, and that's more developer friendly and less verbose. So I think the future is for Bicep. So today we would be looking at Bicep, or we would be choosing Bicep as our infrastructure as code language. We'll be doing all our coding within Visual Studio Code. So before you start, you need to make sure that necessary tools are installed. So first of all, we need to make sure that Azure CLI is installed. So you can install Azure CLI from here, from Microsoft. So I will be leaving that link in the description. Then you need to make sure that once that's done, so basically I have already installed the Azure CLI on my desktop, on my machine, and then you need to make sure that you install the Bicep extension. So for that, it's AZ. So once you install the Azure CLI, you get a command called AZ or AZ, and then once that's in place, in order to install your Bicep extension, so we would type AZ Bicep install. So I already have installed it on my machine. So basically, it returns nothing. And if it has been some time since you already installed Bicep, then you can go ahead and update that using AZ Bicep upgrade. So that's something you need to make sure that you do first of all before you do start anything. So since we already have the basic things in place, let's switch to Visual Studio Code and start coding. So here in Visual Studio Code, I add a new file, and I'll be calling this deployment.bicep. So all Bicep files ends with the extension Bicep. So you also need to make sure that you have installed the Bicep extension within Visual Studio Code. That's another prerequisite. So that's something I missed. So you can go to your extensions tab on Visual Studio Code and install Bicep. So as you can see, I already have installed this. So this is in place. So if you haven't done this, that's another thing you need to make sure that it's in place. Okay, so let's flip back to the deployment.bicep, and right now it's completely empty. And also I want to show that on my Azure portal, I have nothing here. So under the resource group, um, probably I have only this. That's a default one that is from one of my earlier deployments, and I don't have anything here inside that, no resources. So we will start with like I said, a clean slate, and we would start building a new resource group and resources inside that. Okay, back in Visual Studio Code here. The first thing I am going to, so I will type a code here, then I will explain things on my way. So first thing I would do is target scope equal to subscription. So as you can see, Visual Studio Code, since you have the Bicep extension installed, it gives you with the IntelliSense. So subscription. So in Azure, you can create resources, or you can target your Bicep template or ARM template at different levels. So I'm going to do my deployments at the subscription level. So I will talk about the advantages or why I think that's a better option in a minute. So now Like we discussed earlier, we want to start creating a resource group. So for that, you do resource, then mm, so let's say I'm going to create an application that I'm going to call a book app. So basically, I imagine that I'm going to create an application that manages books or a bookstore or something like that. So I need to give a name. So you give a name to all the resources that you create here within Bicep. So later you can use that variable or that name to refer to that resources throughout your code. So let me try to or let me name this as lookup resource group. So this would be my resource group in Azure, and I would be creating everything under that. So okay, so here you go. So you are going to create a resource group, and in Bicep template, you start with the uh, keyword resource, then you give a name, then you specify the schema for that. So everything under in Azure, the Azure ARM templates, they're under a particular schema and a version. So depending upon what kind of resource you are creating, that schema would change. So here I am selecting the schema and its version, and then the syntax goes like this. So the required properties. So I need to give a name for this. So in order to make this a little more reusable, I'm going to create a variable so that I can reuse that throughout this exercise. So in order to create a variable, you start use the keyword var, and then you give a name. So basically I'm going to give a resource group name, and if you remember, I want to create a book up, right? So rg, then probably Mm, so one good naming convention is to in Azure is to prefix your resources with an identifier. So since we are going to create a resource group here, let me call it RG. Let's start with RG. Then mm, best practice is that you create an organization name. So let me call it probably MR. That's my resource. Sorry, the organization. Then my app name, probably that would be book app, right? So that's PA. So now then I construct this resource, all my resource names or resource group names. So for that you can use the string interpolation, like we do in C sharp. So there you create org, then mm, org, then uh, app name, app name, then again uh, your environment probably. So that's another good way to organize that. Let's call it environment. So in the beginning of the video I said that you can reuse these templates. So the how you can reuse this template for different environment is by parameterizing this template. So that's another mechanism by which you can you can reuse this template for different environments. But if you really want to input something into this template, when you execute this, you parameterize that. So for that, you use keyword param. So param and then string. So that's of type string. So this is basically the syntax. So now you have created your resource group name here, and this would be reused throughout this video or throughout this exercise. You can even go one step further, like rather than repeating this again and again, you can bring in another variable, probably that's resource mid name. Let me call it that way. So then I would take all these things from there and put it there, and then here I would use the resource mid name here, so that I will have better usability. So now you have the resource group name here. Let's assign it here. That's how you want to call that resource group that you are going to create. So resource group name, then location. So for every resource that you create in Azure, you need to specify a region or a location, and I want to put this resource or all the resources that I'm going to create under a specific region or a specific location. So let me call it string. Since I am in Canada, I would prefer to create my resources under Canada Central. Okay, so now I'm going to set that here. Um, so basically we have the basic resource group ready now. Now maybe one thing worth mentioning is tags. So let me create uh, another variable called tags, and that would be an object, and I'm going to go. I will talk about that in a minute. App name uh, is app name, that variable. Then environment is environment. So then here I will set, so that's another. So you can always use you press your control space to uh, to bring up those suggestions or autocomplete or intelligence. That would give you all the options, just the way you do in Visual Studio for any .NET project. So basically what you are doing is you are going to create a resource in Azure. I should say a resource group in Azure with a name MRBA dev, with location as Canada Central, and with tags, these tags. So the tags are basically a way to identify your resources. So let's say in this specific example, you have an organization called MR, and inside that a book app, and you have environment dev. So by tagging your resources by that, that app name and environment, uh, you can use that for some useful purposes like billing in Azure. So in Azure, since you have tagged it a specific way, when billing is generated, you can filter it by that. So if you have different environments, different applications, and all that, when Azure bills you, you would be able to filter out, filter in the resources based on these tags. So that's where the importance of tags are. So tags are completely optional, but it's a good way to organize your resources for different purposes in Azure. So now that we have this Azure resource group coded up here, let's go ahead and try to run this and see if it actually creates uh, resource in Azure. Then we would go ahead from there for other resources, within this resource group. So in order to run this, you have a couple of ways. You can use PowerShell commands to run this template, basically deploy this template into Azure. Also, you can use Azure CLI. I personally find Azure CLI simpler to use, so I'm going to use Azure CLI here. So I'm going to type AZ. So before that, you need to make sure that you log into Azure. So Azure login works like AZ login, then you switch then your username. So username, then your password. So I'm gonna stop here for a second so that I don't want to show my password to you. Okay, now I have logged into Azure through AZ or the Azure CLI. Then I'm gonna try to deploy mm, this template into Azure. I'm gonna type a command under terminal AZ deployment. So that's a command to deploy an Azure, Bicep template or an ARM template. Then sub. So sub means you are going to create this under your subscription. So there are a couple of mm, scopes where you can deploy this to. So one of them is a subscription scope. The other one is mm, resource group. So basically you can deploy your resources into a subscription scope or at your resource group level. So if you already have a resource group pre-built, then go ahead and deploy at the resource group level because you already have that resource group ready there. Then you just need to focus on that particular resource group and create your resources dynamically into that particular resource group. But if you don't have that resource group, then go one level higher up and you create your resource group as well. So here in this particular case, since we don't have anything at all, it's a clean slate on Azure. I even wanted to create my resource group dynamically. So that's why I um, scope this the target scope at subscription level, and also I am using a corresponding Azure CLI command here. So AZ deployment sub or subscription, then create. So create a deployment. So that's basically the command. Now one mandatory argument for this is location. So location is in my case Canada Central. You can choose any location you want. That should be a valid one. One thing to keep in mind that is depending upon where you deploy your applications or resources, that can have an impact on the performance of your application. So it's always advised that you choose a location that's closer to you or closer to you or where your clients are. Then you specify the template file. So your template file is your deployment.bicep file, and here let me type that in deployment.bicep. Then you pass in some parameters. So here you have two parameters. So environment, so that's one parameter. So parameters, then uh, environment equal to dev, and Your location parameter is again Canada Central. So let's try to run this. So I'm pressing enter here. Yep, it says it's succeeded. So let me expand it a little bit. And it says that it's succeeded. You can see that the provisioning state is succeeded. So let's verify that by switching to Azure portal here and try to refresh it here. Yeah. So we can see that RGMRBA dev resource group is created for us, and currently it's empty. So in the subsequent exercises, we will create resources inside that, like ultimately we would create a virtual machine, but we have a few steps before that.